this episode, I want to take you through the process of basic timeline editing. It's intended for the absolute video editing beginner, so I won't be doing anything fancy. I'll just be demonstrating the various steps needed to create a watchable video. These steps are: 1. Import a group of video clips into the media panel. 2. Use the trimmer panel to trim individual clips where necessary. 3. Place the clips onto the timeline in a logical sequence. 4. Link the clips together so that the transition between the end of one clip and the start of the next is one that is desirable. 5. Add descriptive text labels, commonly called lower thirds, where necessary. 6. Add one or more titles that will describe the whole video or individual scenes. 7. Render the timeline out to the final video file. So, let's get started. A subject that's not directly applicable to video editing, but is in some ways more important, is shooting the video to be used in the project. There are a few do's and don'ts that, in my opinion, need to be observed when shooting video. Unless you're shooting action, such as motor racing, keep most of your shots static. By that, I mean keep pan shots to a minimum. To eliminate camera drift or shake, use a tripod if possible. Keep your static shots short. To avoid viewer boredom, static shots shouldn't be longer than about 8 seconds. This allows the shot to be trimmed to about 5 seconds on the timeline. There will, of course, be exceptions to this. Shooting a wedding ceremony, for instance. If you must have panned shots, make sure the pan is slow. The viewer needs to be able to take things in, not made dizzy. Panned shots should have a couple of seconds at the beginning and end of the shot where the camera is stationary. Always shoot more video than you think is necessary. You can always cut it out at the editing stage. You can't always go back and shoot it again. Finally, if you're shooting video with a smartphone and your intended delivery is to television, avoid shooting in portrait mode. In my opinion, portrait mode on a widescreen TV is ugly and wastes a good portion of the display. Let's assume that you shot your video and have a number of video clips from that shoot stored on your PC. You've launched Hitfilm and selected Create New from the Start page. You'll then be prompted to define the project properties. Ideally, you should set these properties to match your source material. To do this, select the template drop-down arrow and choose a template that matches your video. The list of templates is quite long, so there should be one that suits. Remember that, as I mentioned in episode 2, you can't export video with a resolution greater than 1920 by 1080, which is full HD. Although my source is 25 frames per second, I'm going to leave the default template, which is 30 frames per second, active for now. You'll see why later on. The settings in the other tab, labelled Rendering, are beyond the scope of this tutorial and should be left alone. After setting the project properties and clicking OK, the user interface will appear. You then need to import the video clips into the media panel, trim them and transfer them onto the timeline. So the first thing to do is make sure that the media panel is open. I want to keep this tutorial reasonably straightforward, so I'll resist describing all the options in the media panel. I'll leave the detail for a later tutorial. The accepted way of imported video clips or any other form of media is to use the import icon. This opens up an Explorer panel where you can browse for your clips and select them. Clicking the Open button then imports the selected video clips into the media panel. You'll find that there's a delay when importing video clips before the thumbnails appear in the media panel. Once in the media panel, the video clips can be displayed and arranged in a number of ways. For now, we'll leave everything as default. The next step is to transfer your media onto the timeline. Basically, there are two ways of doing this. The first and most accepted way is to load each media item into the trimmer and set the in and out points. The trimmed media is then transferred to the timeline. The second method, and the one I prefer, is to transfer all the media items onto the timeline and do all the trimming there. For the purposes of this tutorial, I'll use the accepted method. So I'll select the first clip. This should already be loaded into the trimmer panel. Now I can play the clip and decide how much of it to trim. The thing that you may notice is that the first time you play a clip, there'll be a few frames at the start where the video is frozen. This is because on the first play, the video is cached in memory, so that second and subsequent plays are smooth with no dropped frames. Now you can see that this clip is 8 seconds and 20 frames long. As I mentioned earlier, it's desirable to avoid static shots being too long. This clip's too long to go onto the timeline, so it needs trimming. To recap on trimming, I'll move the trimmer playhead to a suitable point where I want the clip to start. As I mentioned in episode 1, this can be done in a number of ways. I'll do it by changing the playhead position value. At this point, I click the Set In Point icon. I now want to set the point where the clip is to end. I'll do this by moving the playhead along the timeline. I then click the Set Out Point icon. Holding the mouse over the timeline will display both in and out values and the trim clip duration. You can see that the clip is now a more suitable 5 seconds, 16 frames long. You carry out this procedure for all the video clips in the media panel. Occasionally, when selecting a clip, you may see a blank panel with a message, "The video frame cannot be displayed." Don't worry about this, I think it's something to do with caching. Simply play the clip or move the playhead. When you're satisfied with all the trimmed clips, select the one that is to appear first in the video. Normally this will be the first one in the media panel. To transfer the trimmed clip to the timeline, make sure that the timeline playhead is at the start of the timeline, then click the Insert Clip icon or press the B key. If your project settings don't match your source material, you'll see a message box pop up. If you remember, I purposely allowed the frame rate in the project settings to be different from my source material frame rate. This gives you the option to correct that. In this case, I do want the project settings to match my video, so I'll select Yes. The trimmed clip will then be placed on the timeline starting at the beginning. That procedure has to be repeated for each trimmed clip. Now that the clips have been trimmed and are on the timeline, it's time to proceed with the editing process. Throughout a video, each individual clip is joined to the previous clip by a transition. At the moment, the clips are joined together by what's referred to as a basic cut transition. This is where one video ends abruptly when the next one starts, and is used extensively in movies. However, sometimes a scene can be enhanced by other transitions. There are numerous types of transitions, but a few common types are as follows. Fade in, fade out. The end of one clip fades out to a colour, usually black, then the next clip fades in from the same colour. Dissolve. The two clips overlap each other at the end of the first clip and the start of the next clip. The length of the overlap is arbitrary, but is usually dependent on the content of the two clips. Wipe. In this transition, the first clip moves off to the right or left and is replaced by the second clip. As with most effects in video editing, less is more when it comes to transitions. Most of the transitions in my videos are basic cuts, with a few dissolves and fade in, fade outs where appropriate. Just because the different types are available, don't think that you have to use every one in your videos. Back to the editing. As it is, the timeline is contracted, and it's difficult to work on the transitions like this. So I'll expand the timeline so that I can work better. I do this by clicking on the increment scale icon. That's the one like a magnifying glass with a plus sign in it. If the first clip doesn't start at the beginning of the timeline, just left click and drag over the clips to select them all, then pull them to the start. The first clip usually starts with a fade in. For this tutorial, I'll describe the easiest way of applying a fade in. To achieve this, you need to first open up the effects panel. To locate the fade transition, click in the Search in Effects box and type Fade. As you can see, there are several types of fade. Some are not available in this version and some are for audio. The one we want is Fade to Colour. You'll be using this transition a lot in your editing, so it makes sense to save it to the Favourites folder. You do this by clicking on the yellow star at the side of the transition's name. Now click on the transition and drag it to the start of the first clip. You'll see that as soon as the transition has been applied, its properties are displayed in the Controls panel, which opens automatically. The default transition length is 1 second, which should suit for most occasions. You can change the length on the clip if necessary by clicking and dragging the right-hand edge of the transition. You'll see a label appear showing the new transition length as you drag. You'll also see that the viewer displays details as well. Depending on your PC specs, you may need to wait a few seconds for caching to take place before the change in transition length is reflected in timeline playing. Under the timeline ruler, you'll see a blue line which displays the caching progress. Caching is complete when the blue line fills the timeline. The playback of the timeline should now be smooth. That's the video part of the first clip seen to. To prevent an abrupt start to the audio, we need to introduce a similar fade transition to its beginning. I'll switch back to the effects panel. Amongst the fade transitions, you'll see two for audio. Select the one labelled Fade and click on the Favourites star. Now drag this transition to the start of the audio. You'll notice that the Controls panel doesn't open this time. That's because there are no editable properties for this transition. As with the video fade, the length of the audio fade can be changed by dragging the right-hand edge of the transition. The next thing to do is to decide how subsequent clips are joined together. In other words, what transitions to use. My favourite transition is the basic cut. As mentioned earlier, you'll see this used extensively in movies. I do, though, have a minor modification to the basic cut that I like to use. Instead of the end of one clip butting up to the start of the next clip, I like to overlap the join by 4 frames. Technically, I've changed it into a 4-frame dissolve. I think that the transition from one clip to the next is easier on the eyes this way, rather than with an abrupt change. So, because it's basically a shortened dissolve transition, I need to locate and apply this transition between clips 1 and 2. This will display a list of all the effects containing that word. The one we want is called cross dissolve. I'll deal with the other types of dissolve in a future tutorial. Again, it's a good idea to make this transition a favourite. Now I need to drag the cross dissolve over to the timeline and drop it on the join between the two clips. Because the default transition length is 1 second, I need to reduce this so that it covers the last 2 frames of clip 1 and the first 2 frames of clip 2. This is achieved by holding the mouse pointer over one end of the transition until the cursor changes to a brace symbol. You can then click and drag the end inwards. You'll see that the length changes such that the transition stays centered over the cut. Drag inwards until the new duration shows 4 frames. The basic cut only occurs on the video track, so to avoid an abrupt change in the audio, I need to introduce a dissolve there as well. In the case of audio, the transition is called a crossfade and can be located in the same way that the dissolve was located. I can now drag the crossfade transition over to the join in the audio track. It's down to personal choice whether you leave the length at 1 second or to change it for something else. Now, if I move the playhead over the next 2 clips, I can see that they have the same subject, a fountain. This is a case where a full dissolve transition is ideal. One scene dissolves into another. So I'll locate the dissolve transition in the effects panel. It'll be easy to locate now because it's located in the Favorites folder. As described previously, I'll drag the transition over the cut between the 2 clips. This time I'm going to leave the length as default. As previously, I'll insert an audio crossfade on the audio track at this point. Now for the transition between the 3rd and 4th clip. If I play these two clips, you can see that there is an apparent distance between the two scenes. This is a situation where another type of transition is appropriate, the fade in, fade out transition. To achieve this, first I simply move all the clips to the right of the third clip, so that there's a gap of about 15 frames between the two clips. I can do this by lassoing all the clips with the mouse. This is fine for this project as there aren't a lot of clips. However, if your project contains hundreds of clips, that method isn't really productive. The more productive method involves enabling the Track Select tool. This tool allows all clips to one side of the mouse cursor to be selected. The tool has two modes. The default one selects all clips to the right, and the other selects all clips to the left. In this case, I'll use the default mode as I want to select all clips to the right of the third one. I can now move these clips 15 frames to the right. As I move the clips, you can see in the viewer panel 3 time displays. Keep moving the clips until the blue display shows 15 frames. Once done, it's important to deselect the Track Select tool by clicking on the Selection tool. Now that I have a 15 frame gap, I need to apply video and audio fades as described previously. The last 3 clips contain the same subject, so I'll use the dissolve transition on the 2 cuts. At the end of the last clip, I'll use the fade to colour and fade transitions on the video and audio respectively. This time I'll increase the fade length to 2 seconds to give a nice long fade out. Let's look at how the whole video looks. You will have noticed that there's a fair amount of camera drift in the video. This can occur if you shoot without using a tripod. Hitfilm has a video stabilizer tool that does a reasonable job of smoothing out the video. However, if you use it in this version, a watermark will be placed onto the stabilized video. I'll apply it to the first clip so you can see the result. With the effects panel open, I'll search for stabilizer. There'll be a delay while the clip is analysed, and when it completes you'll see multiple green crosses on the viewer panel. These crosses are sampling points used by the stabilizer and will disappear when the clip is played. Note the Hitfilm watermark in the lower right corner. As I mentioned, this tool is only available in the paid-for versions. However, there is a way to stabilize clips using a tool that is available in this version, and I think it does a better job. Using it is quite complex though, so I'll have to show you in another tutorial. One final thing before I go ahead and add a couple of titles. At least one of the clips has quite loud audio. This may or may not be desirable. If necessary, the volume of any particular clip can be adjusted to a more acceptable level. You do this by hovering the mouse pointer over the volume indicator of the clip concerned, then clicking and dragging either up or down. We'll now complete the editing by including a title and a lower third. I'll start by adding a title at the beginning. To do this, I first need to decide how long the title should play for. Titles don't usually contain much text, so the duration should be about 6 seconds. This allows a 1-second fade at either end, with 4 seconds to read the text. So I need to create a 6-second gap at the start of the project. To do this, I'll use the Track Select tool again. To create a simple title, I'm going to use the Text tool. You could of course create your own title in an image editor, then import it into your project's media panel. To create a simple title, click on the Text tool and start typing. I now need to modify some of the text attributes. To do this, I open up the text panel. Here I can change the attributes of the text in a number of ways. For now, I'll simply change the font color and the font size. I now need to center it in the viewer. I'll use the viewer on-screen controls to do this. I just now need to complete the title by applying fade to color transitions at either end. Now I really need a gap between the title and the first clip, so I'll use the Track Select tool to do this. Now for the lower third. As I mentioned earlier, a lower third is one or two lines of text that describes the scene. The easiest way of doing this is to create a text event, such as the one for the title. This time though, it needs to be placed on a track above the scene to be described. You'll find that the attributes from the title have been carried forward to this event. Finally, I'll move it into a suitable position and add two cross-dissolve transitions. Notice that I've used cross dissolves. I need the lower third to fade out rather than fade to colour. When you're satisfied with the project, you can export it to a suitable format. The most popular format is MP4, and most modern TVs will accept this format. You start by clicking the export icon at the top right of the editor panel. This will open a list of export options. I'm not going to go through these now, but the one you want to select is to File. Selecting this opens up an Explorer window where you can browse to a suitable location and name the file. When you click the Save button, the Export panel opens and displays the progress. You will see a warning notice reminding you that a watermark will be shown on the exported video if effects or features used are not available in this version. The format preset is the default YouTube 1080p HD preset, which will do for most purposes. If you need a different preset, I'll be describing how to modify the export parameters in a future tutorial. As you can gather from the length of this tutorial, for the beginner, editing a simple project isn't all that simple. I've tried to make it easier by setting out the major steps in chapter form. This way, you, the viewer, can quickly go to the section that you want to reference. Join me for the next episode where I'll start to explore some of the more advanced features of this software. Hit the subscribe button if you haven't already done so, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now.